Okay, here we go. This is my pie crust demonstration recipe. We have 2¼ cups of all-purpose, 2¼ cups of all-purpose flour, a tablespoon of sugar. I know that sounds a little strange. A teaspoon of salt and a teaspoon of vinegar. This is 3/4 cup of butter, salted butter. I don't use any shortening or any oil in my pie crust. It comes out better, I think, this way. The fact that the butter is comprised of both fat and liquid produces some steam while it's baking, and this allows it to get layers that are lifted by the steam, but the fat still causes the flour to not form a glutinous mass. Then, because I like pie crust that tastes good, I also use 2 egg yolks, a teaspoon of vinegar, and between 4 and 6 tablespoons of ice water. I usually start with 4, and that's about all the further that I go. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to put the liquid ingredients over here to the side. You also need one of these tools if you don't have one of these. You could do this in a KitchenAid mixer with a paddle attachment. You could also do this in a food processor. I own a food processor. I don't use it for this because I think it comes out better when you do it this way by hand rather than a machine. You can also use forks or even 2 butter knives. Worst comes to worst, you could even use your own hands, but that tends to melt the butter rather rapidly. You want all these things kind of chilled, especially the butter and the flour. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add the flour in here. Get rid of that. Add the sugar and the salt. I use kosher salt just because it's what I'm used to using in commercial kitchens, and it's what I use when I bake yeast-raised breads, simply because it is very pure and it has a nice clean taste to it. I'm going to put all the butter in here, and I'm going to just coat it really quick with flour, try to break it up so it's individual chunks a little bit, and that is that. So put that away. That's where this tool comes in to handy. Now this seems like it might take a long time, but once you get used to doing it, it actually goes pretty fast. It's slow at the beginning, but once you get the hang of these things, the pastry cutter or blender, whichever you call it, they work pretty well. As you can see, it's already starting to mash up the butter into tiny little pieces, and that's really what we're after. We want to combine the flour and the butter, but we don't want it to be melted butter. We want it to still be somewhat solid. When the butter gets really small in this process, we're going to stop, and I'm going to use my hands just on the very last bit of it because I don't want any really big chunks of butter. Little pea-sized pieces, see, that's too big. So we want to get rid of those and work that into the flour. Really what the butter does is it coats the flour granules, and when it does that, it stops it from being able to form gluten, which is the stuff that you want when you're baking bread, but not when you're making a pie crust. So by doing this, it's called shortening the flour, hence the reason why fat in recipes is often called shortening, or you even see it sold that way, because that's what it's doing, is it's shortening the gluten molecules or gluten strands from forming. So a little bit is okay, but just a little bit. We don't want much. As you can see, this is kind of now starting to take on the resemblance of something other than flour. It's getting kind of a coarse texture to it. I'm not sure if it's coming through on the camera, but there's still a few small lumps of butter in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to blend this together the rest of the way by using a lot of force with my hands and just smushing the flour and butter together. You do want this to remain cool because you don't want melted butter. So when all the little butter lumps are kind of down, you have to kind of feel it, and you want this to be a little bit sticky. See how it kind of sticks together but then crumbles apart and it looks like oh, I don't know, something. They always say coarse meal. I guess that's coarse meal. So but about this texture is really what you're after. So at this point I'm pretty much gonna just call it good. Let me wipe my hands off a little bit. This is where the weird part comes in. We're going to add those liquid ingredients. And I know this seems a little unusual to add vinegar. I use apple cider vinegar. And then 2 whole egg yolks, just the yolks. So we're going to add that in there. Get as much of that out of there as I can. Okay. Push it off. And I use these at room temperature. You don't have to use them at room temperature, but I generally find when I bake, I get better results with my egg yolks at room temperature, or just eggs in general, for pretty much anything I use eggs for. So then I'm going to start with 4 tablespoons of water. And this is ice water. You can hear the ice clinking around in there. 3 and 4, and this should be adequate. You can go as high as 6 tablespoons, but this is Florida and it's rather humid here, so I really don't need as much water as I might say like in Colorado. Now in Colorado you don't want it to get it too moist because you're at high altitude. You want things a little drier for baking. But most everywhere else, if you're in a humid environment, your flour is going to have a certain amount of moisture to it already. And down here in Florida, we certainly have that. So it doesn't take as much water. So I'm just going to use my hand to mix this together, just until it starts to clump together as a dough. It's a little messy, but my hand is about the best thing I've ever found for doing this. My hands are clean. They were washed very well, thank you. So I'm just going to smush this together, and it's still cold because of the ice water and because of the chilled butter, and that's one of the important things, is we always want to keep it at least cool. It doesn't necessarily have to be freezing cold, but cool is definitely the way to go here. So this actually seems like I might have used a little too much water, but I think it'll still work. This dough is, because of the egg and the vinegar, it's actually a little more forgiving than straight shortening based dough. It doesn't come out as necessarily as flaky, but sometimes I've had flaky pastry doughs that have been super flaky but didn't taste very good. Tasted kind of like raw flour. And, you know, it's part of the whole process in pie making. So you want that to taste good too. And this is a really good tasting pie dough. And it does get nice and flaky. But, okay, so that's pretty much all we need to do to it at this point. I'm going to separate it into two masses because I'm going to make a double crust pie. I'm going to make an apple pie. And I'm doing all of this by the magic of television, which means I've already prepped everything. So that's how much dough you come out with. It's about 1.5 inches thick right now, but I'm going to pinch off a section of it here. This is going to be my top crust, and that's probably about 7 ounces, and this is about 9 ounces right here. So the next thing that's really important to do with this is you've got to chill it for at least a half an hour. If it's not chilled the first time, it just won't, it just gets too smushy and you don't end up with a good texture on it. So I'm just going to wrap it up. I'm going to smush it out a little bit though. It's easier to start out with a disc rather than a ball. So I'm just wrapping it in wax paper. You could use saran wrap if you want. I prefer the paper. Not really a big deal though. So, okay. So I'm going to put this in the fridge to chill for about a half an hour. But instead of editing the video, I'm actually just going to pull one out that's already chilled. And we'll go from there. So, this is the larger piece. I'm going to scrape this down because I don't want any pieces sticking to my surface here. This is actually a silicone baker's mat. And they're really nice because they don't stick. But I still use a little bit of flour on the bottom when I'm rolling this out. Now, I use this type of rolling pin, but if you don't have that variety, some people have this variety. They're both good. You know, you can use whatever you have. So, I'm going to roll this out. As you can see up here, now you're upside down from me. I put this on here facing me, but I'm sorry about that. We're going to make this for a 10-inch pie. But because this is a bottom crust, I'm actually going to roll it to this outer edge here. This says 10 here and it says 12 here. And I'm going to actually fill in the 12 circle with this and roll it out beyond that. Right now it's pretty hard, so you'll see it crack and break as I go along here. And it does take some muscle to get this going. But that's okay. So as long as it's chilled, that's what we're after. And don't worry about these big cracks. You can just push this back together right here. You know, as you go along. Also, if you have cracks in it at the end, we can always kind of push them back together and patch them down a little bit. So you want to roll from the center out in pretty much every direction. Okay, and there I got a little stickiness going on there. So I'm going to put some flour down to make this a little less adhesive on my rolling pin. I've had this rolling pin for a long time and it has a little bit of damage on it on one side right there, and it tends to stick there. So a little bit of flour on the top won't hurt it any. I normally would put a little bit of flour underneath, but I kind of forgot. So we're just going to roll this out from the center out, and we're going to try and keep it even as we're going along. You know, it's not super important, but it does make a better pie when it's all uniform. So like right here, we're getting a little hole there. We're just going to kind of smush that back together. Maybe smush these cracks here, because we still have a ways to go on this. Sorry about my dogs in the background. They are a noisy crew. They want in, but they're outside, so they don't disturb me. Okay. Alright. Now let's just keep rolling. That, and we'll bring it over here. Smush that right in there. So sometimes this is just a little tedious. This is very cold. Also, my surface is stainless steel underneath this. If you have a stone countertop at home, that'll stay rather cool. You can also take a flat bottomed, like a cookie sheet or any kind of flat bottom pan, fill it with some ice, and you can chill your countertop. And that'll also help you keep this cold. And the colder it stays until it goes into the oven, the better. So, we're getting there here. Just be patient with me. Now, I'm only going to just put this into the pie shell. I'm not actually doing this video on the instruction of the pie, of how to make the pie, just the pie crust. If you don't have one of these mats, and most people don't, that's okay. You can use a couple pieces of, I'm pushing some of the thick, it's real thick over here on this side and real thin on that side, so I'm going to push some of it from the one side to the other just to make it a little more even. Whoops, got a little tear there, that's alright. I'll just push that down. So, okay. So, now that I have it rolled out all the way past that edge, get this off of my rolling pin so I don't get stickiness. I'm going to show you how to roll it up and put it onto the pie pan. And this is, some people have a method. My mother does it with a bunch of wax paper, which seems kind of wasteful to me because you're only using it once. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just pick up the edge of my mat here, and I'm going to actually kind of, let me put a little flour in this so it doesn't stick to itself. A little bit more. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up the edge of this and just kind of roll it onto my rolling pin. As soon as I can get it off of my silicone here. Okay, here it comes. Alright, cool. So, I'm just going to roll this up on my rolling pin. And you'll see a little bit of it's going to stick to the surface, and that's okay. I should have floured it first, but it won't hurt anything. We're going to just take that and get rid of it. So, let me grab a pan, a pie dish real quick, and we'll go from there. Okay, now this is not my first choice of pie dishes. I like the metal ones with the perforations in the bottom, and that has a tendency to make it so that the pie gets a little air underneath. You don't get such a soggy crust on the bottom. So, now that I have this rolled up on my rolling pin, I'm going to turn it around so that it's facing me, but just do all this in reverse. And I'm just going to unroll it off the rolling pin right onto the pie dish. Okay, now we're going to kind of push it down into the dish. A little hole there, we're just going to patch that a little bit. If this starts to look a little dry and you need to make a repair, you can always do that. That's easy enough. But we just want to push it into the dish like that, and that's really all that we need to do. Then I kind of roll down the outsides here. There's a little hole there, so we're going to fill that up. So then I'm just going to go around with a knife and I'm going to cut off the excess. Now, if you were doing a single crust pie that was, you know, like a chocolate pie or something where you use a pie crust that's pre-baked, this is where you would stop. You would take I would take aluminum foil, line this with aluminum foil. If you have pie weights, you can put the pie weights in. Otherwise, dry beans work, rice works, anything to hold it down. You would also want to poke a few holes in it if you're using a solid pan like this one, or solid pie dish rather. If you have one with perforations on the bottom, you don't need to do that. At that point, this would be ready to decorate the edge and put in the oven. This, like I said, is going to turn into a 2-crust pie. And the next step would be to put your filling in, apples, cherries, whatever. Roll out the second piece of dough, follow the same directions. Crimp the top and bake it at whatever temperatures you want. I baked this one earlier. This is an apple pie. Baked a little too long, sorry, I did burn it. Not bad, but it's right there. And we're going to cut it and see how it looks on the inside. And you can, it's probably going to be a little runny still because it's still very hot. But you can at least get an idea of what this pastry looks like when it's completely done. It's a little runny still inside. But we'll just pull a piece of this off. As you can see, it's kind of flaky. We'll set that to the side. But as you can see, it's rather flaky. And it is a very delicious crust. It's almost a cookie. Because it has a little bit of sweetness to it. It's almost a slightly cookie-like texture. If you really are bad at pie crust, I will do another demonstration on pie crust for a completely different type of pie crust that is not flaky at all, but nobody will ever complain because it is that good. It's called a lemon sabli pie crust, and I will do that one perhaps tomorrow. But for now, this is the end of this demo, and there's the pie. Yum. Good luck. If you have questions, you can ask me.